the biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that it can dominate all of East Asia, and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, that's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything along the lines that they thought they could. And the yuan is only traded internally because it's the most manipulated currency in history. The euro confiscates bank deposits to pay for bailouts. Are there things that the Fed could do better, in my opinion? Of course. But compared to all the competition, I mean, there isn't any competition. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and it exports via 4 main routes, one to China, one to the Baltic Sea, one to the Black Sea, and then via pipe to Europe. What's going on right now because of the Ukraine war is that the pipes that go to Europe are going to be disrupted either by the war itself or because Ukrainian partisans are targeting Russian income flows. One way or another, those pipes aren't surviving this year. The stuff that goes to the Black Sea is in a war zone. So insurance companies will not give the indemnification that is necessary for vessels to operate in that area. So the only way a ship can go and dock at Novorossiysk right now is if a country gives it sovereign indemnification and takes all the risk. Some of that is happening with the Chinese. It might be happening with the Indians. That's a little touch you can go. They're still under negotiation. Primorsk, that's the Baltic port, so right next to St. Petersburg. That is not in a war zone. So you can get insurance to go to Primorsk. However, ship captains, for the most part, are refusing to go, and European dock workers are refusing to unload the cargo when it arrives. So that is still in use, but not nearly as much, maybe a quarter of what it used to be before the war started. And then the final pipes either terminate Pacific coast near Vladivostok, or there is a short spur line that goes down into Docking in northeastern China. The western 3, Black Sea, the pipes to Europe, Baltic Sea, those are interconnected to a degree. So if there's a problem at one port or on one pipe, they can redirect some, less than a third, but some of the crude to other places. It is completely disconnected from the eastern pipes that go to China and Japan. So if all the stuff in the West is shut down, which is what I think is going to happen, none of it can go east. The rail line is already operating beyond capacity. The pipelines are already full. You would have to build a fundamentally new infrastructure from the fields in northwest Siberia to Chinese population centers. That is greater than the distance from Miami to Anchorage, most of which is through virgin territory that is very rugged. That's a 10-year program, minimum, even with the Chinese building it. So one way or another, we are looking at those Western flows, which add up to 4 to 5 million barrels a day, going offline. There's still about 1.5 million barrels refined product that might go out, but most of that is going out via rail. So that'll be a little trickier to disrupt. I figure the Europeans can maybe disrupt half of that if they really want to. But we're looking at the single largest removal of crude from the market ever. And in proportional terms, it's going to have a shock somewhat similar to World War II. And that assumes that there are no downstream effects anywhere. Because we have insurance companies not doing it, shipping companies not doing it, dock workers not doing it, and now Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger have pulled out, and they do the technical work that makes a lot of this possible. All the super majors are gone. We even have a couple of major projects out in Sakhalin that are probably just going to die because the Russians can't make those projects work by themselves. Most of the oil and gas out of that goes to China. So we're actually looking at an environment where the Chinese see reduced flows rather than increased, as Russia is just melon scooped out of the market. Okay, so first the splash that's in the news, second the stuff that's behind it that's actually more important, and then the third what's coming. So the splash that's in the news is going after the oligarchs. In the 1990s, a group of people took advantage of the collapse of the Soviet system and grabbed assets for themselves by any number of means. Very little of it was what we would consider illegal, or what the Russian law would consider illegal, because there wasn't a lot of Russian law then, but it was definitely unethical. And they have now become multi-billionaires. This first batch of oligarchs, when Putin came in the year 2000, he brought them to heel. He made them a deal that if they stayed completely out of politics, he would not go after their assets. And so there's been this truce between them for the last 20 years. Under Putin, he elevated a number of people from his FSB days, KGB days, based on who's doing the math, to take over large portions of the Russian economy. This includes things like the defense industry, Gazprom, which is the world's largest natural gas company, and Rosneft, which is the world's second largest oil company. And these are all people who were not part of that original group. These are people who are all in Putin's inner circle. So we're going after two different groups of oligarchs here. The ones that are around Putin, totally worth it. These are people who have been with Putin bolted to the hip with every single policy he's done for 20 years. These people should be brought down. The other people, the folks that have been there since the 1990s, I don't mean to suggest that they're kinder, gentler folks. I mean, they are robber barons at best. But going after them just makes you feel good because they have very little influence over Putin. So we're talking here about melon scooping the entire core out of the Russian economy by going after the leadership, but one group is not going to affect the war whatsoever. And that's that first group in the 90s. They're the ones who have most of their assets overseas. So they're the ones who are actually vulnerable to what's going on. Now, behind that, we didn't just sanction a bunch of companies and people. We sanctioned the Russian central bank. And we don't think of how important a central bank is in systems because we always assume it's a neutral actor in the background that maybe messes around with interest rates and bond purchases, and that's about it. But they are the primary connectivity point between any economy and the rest of the world. One of the thousands reasons that I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin is it assumes that the central banks, A, will empower it, and B, will do nothing to impede it. And that's clearly not true. And in the case of the Russian central bank, they can no longer deal with any entity in any of these countries and access any currencies that are dollars, euros, yen, won, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, Taiwanese dollars, and I'm sure I've met Swiss francs, and I'm sure I've left out a bunch. So anything that the bank tries to do anywhere cannot use any of those normal channels. And so among other things, that denied the Russians access to some 90% of their currency reserves. That means that when they sell oil, somebody has to physically do a transfer in a third party and fly the money into Moscow. This is not a tenable situation. We tried doing some version of this for Iran and it was crushing, but we've never done it to an economy this big or this holistically. And then what's coming? We have a number of sanctions against Russia. It's the most sanctioned country in history now. Actually, it has more sanctions on it than all other countries in all other time frames throughout human history. The Europeans are now talking about an open ban on all sales of Russian crude. Not just to the Europeans themselves, because all that would do is shift the pain. They're talking, at the beginning of the process, of talking about making sure that Russian crude can't make it to market anymore. That would mean, among other things, blocking ships from going in and out of the Baltic Sea, probably at the Skagerrak, and probably blocking ships going in and out of the Black Sea, probably through the Turkish Straits. Now, how the Russians would respond to that would be really interesting, but if the blockades are further back from Russian ports, the Russians militarily can't do anything about it. So we're looking here at removing 4 to 5 million barrels a day of crude production from the world. That is more than enough to guarantee an energy-induced depression that is global in scale. And the crazy thing is, we might even get there without an official sanction, because insurance companies are not allowing ships to go into these ports. The ports are shallow, so they can't take super tankers and then run it to China. So either you get this daisy chain of dozens of mid-sized vessels that are going to be loading onto a super tanker in sight of a NATO port and expecting that NATO is not going to do anything about it, or they just close the strait altogether. One way or another, we are headed for a very interesting year. Let me put it to you from the point of view of an outsider. So here we've got the United States, who has been moving down a path towards isolationism for 30 years, and it just wakes up one day, decides that it wants to get involved in the Ukrainian-Russian situation. It's been removing troops from the Middle East. It's been removing troops from Asia. It's been removing troops from Europe. When Biden was elected, we were at the low point for international involvement since Reconstruction. We had fewer troops stationed abroad since Reconstruction. So, we're at a 150-year low right now. And now we're telling people that they can't use the dollar or any currency. Everyone who thought that the American retreat was going to give rise to a multipolar world in which the United States had minimal power really hadn't been paying attention to how the world works. To have a global currency, the first thing you have to be sure of is that the country that issues the currency has to really not care about what happens with it every single day. Because if they're going to manipulate the currency in order to achieve trade advantages, then nobody's going to want it. And in addition, it has to be, sufficiently deep pool of liquidity in order to work. There's only one country that fits that criteria. There's only one country that's fit that criteria since 1945, and it's certainly not China. And people are discovering now, countries are discovering now, that if you want to be part of that system, there are certain things you can and cannot do. Invading countries that, for whatever reason, the United States should not be invaded makes the list. And so I would say that the biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that can dominate all of East Asia and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, that's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything.
This is a straight up population density map by state and province. The two quadrants in the west and the quadrant in the lower right, those three quadrants of the world are net exporters of food and energy and minerals. The remaining one, the top right, is a net importer of everything. In fact, you can narrow it down. This circle is a net importer of everything and the rest of the world is a net exporter. The country that is most dependent on the US Navy to keep everything safe and flowing freely is China. Now, people talk about the Chinese having a big navy, 600 ships. Yes, that is relevant, but only about 60 of them can sail more than 1,000 miles from shore. And that assumes they're going slow and in a straight line to save fuel. In combat conditions, they can only go about 350 miles. At current rates of naval build-out, China will be able to displace the US Navy around the year 2450. I don't burn a lot of brain power on worrying about this one. But the Chinese do, and they should. Because everything that's going down in the world today from a security point of view is a direct threat to not just their potential rise, but to their very existence. Okay, back to your world. This is total investment into all oil and all gas from all state and all private sources. Back in 2014, at its peak, a narrative took hold in the world's financial capitals. Fossil fuels are done. And since it takes 5 to 15 years to break even on a project and 3 to 8 years to bring it online, why in the world would you throw your money away when you know that by 2035 it's going to be gone anyway? Now, there's a lot of things about that train of thought that are derailed, in my opinion, but it took hold in Tokyo and Paris and in New York. And overall investment into the space plummeted. 3 to 8 years to bring a project online. Keep that. Because it's not the same everywhere. This is one of my favorite graphic sequences. This is what I like to call the checkbook map, because everyone with a dot paid their power bill. Here are the world's conventional oil and gas basins. Pay particular attention to North America and the Persian Gulf, because here's where the shale is. There's a dozen major reasons why US shale is fundamentally different from energy anywhere else and of any other kind. But for today's discussion, this is by far the most important. We produce it where we live and no one else does.